Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Inspiration Action series. Inspiration Action is our latest virtual series to inspire participants to take action and to become civically engaged in their communities. And speaking of being civically engaged, I hope you get out to vote today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Linda Maxwell. I'm the program manager at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. Today's program is about financial literacy, keys to creating and sustaining wealth for African Americans. And before we begin, I would like to briefly go over the rules of engagement. After the speaker speaks for 20 to 30 minutes, we will open up the program to receive your questions. Feel free to type your questions in the chat or the question box, and we will try to answer as many as possible. Today's special guest is Martin A. Smith. Mr. Smith is a 20-plus year veteran in the financial services industry and specializes in retirement planning, investment management, and fiduciary consulting. He has a master's degree in commercial real estate finance from Georgetown University and a bachelor's degree in legal communications from Howard University in Washington, D.C. He has earned several additional financial certifications, including accredited investment fiduciary, accredited analyst, financial planning specialist, and chartered retirement planning counselor. He makes regular media appearances, having been a guest on several affiliate stations for NBC and CBS. He currently splits his time between Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, where he is actively training and hiring new financial advisors, as well as recruiting for his investment firm. He and his family currently lives in the Washington, D.C. area. Thank you, Mr. Smith, for joining us today. What is the key to sustaining financial wealth for African Americans, and why is financial literacy just one side of the coin?
Thank you for having me. Certainly appreciate this opportunity. It's an honor to represent Wealthcare Financial Group and also the community that I've spent 30 years sort of growing up in when I moved to Washington, D.C. to attend Howard University in 1988. So to your question, the key to wealth building and wealth creation and sustaining wealth, particularly for African Americans, it definitely does begin with financial literacy. It begins with taking ownership of the information that is available to us and not being dismayed by just the depth and the volume of financial information. It's not something that's traditionally been taught in schools and in a lot of our homes. So you just have to start where you are. That's basically how I started many years ago. I started reading articles from Investors Business Daily, and I read that paper for about a year straight and saved every paper. And I started reading books. And then I decided to make a career change and start working in the investment field. This was, I guess, starting back in 1994. But how we got on this subject today of talking about financial literacy and also a broader topic that's really important, that's making a lot of news today, such known as the racial wealth gap. A number of years ago, I was asked to write an article for an online publication about how to close the racial wealth gap in America. This publication, I believe, was called the North Star News. And being new to this particular subject, and coupled with the many years that I have worked in the investment industry as a financial advisor, I concluded initially that education is the great equalizer that would effectively close the wealth gap. And it's true, education is an equalizer in many respects. So in my article and in subsequent blog posts, I argued how the Jim Crow era has contributed to the wealth gap through its racist and discriminatory policies, from housing, access to loans, voting rights, African Americans being denied for many years a GI Bill, in some respects, Social Security, and also jobs and discrimination. One of the points that I raised in my initial blog post about financial literacy and being essential for wealth creation among African Americans in particular is that for many years, brokerage firms were less likely to hire African Americans as stockbrokers. If you think about it, a financial advisor, an individual who works for a big brokerage firm, is sort of like an ambassador back to his neighborhood. So if you work at, name it, Merrill Lynch or Morgan Stanley or any of these big brokerage firms, if you come from a family that has regular conversations about money, then you're probably going to also sort of have friends and family in your community. If that is sort of the composition of your community and your family and friends. But as you can imagine, if there's very little hiring of African Americans to work in this industry that we refer to affectionately as on Wall Street, even if we're not physically on Wall Street, then you're not going to have very many ambassadors going back into the community to educate African Americans about financial literacy, about the stock market, and so forth. So this resulted, as I stated, in fewer people within the African American community bringing the knowledge of Wall Street back to their communities where we were raised. And since publishing that blog post entitled Financial Literacy, Key to Creating and Sustaining Wealth for African Americans, I've read numerous studies about the socioeconomic impact of racism in America, including disparities in wealth resulting from slavery and Jim Crow. And so what I concluded is that financial literacy is just one side of the coin. This is a coin with two sides. The other side is dependent on public policy, and I would say good and restorative public policy, which is to close the wealth gap. So as a result, my understanding of the cause of the wealth gap has become more clear. And I admit I was wrong in this regard. Financial literacy, it is immensely important, but it will not reverse the damage done by more than 90 years of Jim Crow discrimination and 246 years prior of slavery, and while also effectively closing the wealth gap. So it takes more than just learning about money. If I give a person a ton of knowledge, but if their access to wealth is restricted systemically in the country, and this, I'm talking about going back, 1877 to about, the early 1960s, just during those crucial years when America's industrial age was booming and wealth was being created and communities were growing. A lot of those years we missed out on in wealth building. So we were really late to the game in that regard. So financial literacy, it can help someone achieve better personal stewardship. It could lead to accumulating wealth on an individual level, but it would not equalize the disparity in wealth because the disparity that exists between white and Black Americans. Public policy can be a lot more useful in closing the wealth gap than financial literacy. According to a 2019 survey of consumer finances, it shows that longstanding and substantial wealth disparities between families and different racial and economic and ethnic groups were little changed since the last survey. The typical white family has 8 times the wealth of the typical African-American family and 5 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic family. So I became more convinced in the potential of public policy to improve the economic status of African Americans while working on my master's degree at Georgetown in commercial real estate finance. I researched topics such as how state and federal housing policy was negatively influenced by racism and discrimination. And I'm talking about specifically former federal housing policy that we know as redlining. And there's numerous books written on this subject. You can just Google redlining. And in fact, even after redlining was outlawed and the Federal Housing Administration stopped engaging that practice, financial institutions and banks to this day are still engaged in redlining. If you Google the word redlining and then followed by the name of just by any national bank, you're going to find just a number of lawsuits that have resulted from these types of practices to this day. But a really good book is called The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It is an incredible book. So I would highly recommend that everyone reads it, and just to really get an appreciation for how discrimination, how pervasive it was. It wasn't just in limiting access to jobs. It was also in the literal built infrastructure in many cities. I'm talking roads, highways, overpasses, where they were built particularly to segregate people by race. And so a lot of the essential community resources were not found in the African-American community, most in the white community. And so this happened in cities like Minneapolis, Minnesota, East Palo Alto, California, Detroit, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, just nationwide. And so all of these things contributed to the wealth gap, including, of course, as you know, Chicago. So lastly, I can attribute my enlightenment in this regard, I guess, to becoming more clear about the impact of the wealth gap on the lack of financial literacy, to an article that was written in the Atlantic by a fellow Howard alum named Ta-Nehisi Coates entitled "The Case for Reparations." And on the basis of that article he wrote, he was invited to testify before Congress on Juneteenth in 2019 in a House hearing about H.R. 40 on reparations, which is just the late Representative John Conyers' painstaking, consistent appeal to Congress to study the impact of slavery and Jim Crow on African Americans and how that has contributed to this enormous wealth gap, and how, unfortunately, that also contributes to perpetuating financial illiteracy. So let's talk about some facts and figures on wealth disparity. According to the 2019 consumer survey of consumer finances, white families have the highest level of both median and mean family wealth, $188,200 and $983,400 respectively. African-American families median and mean wealth is less than 15% of white families at $14,100 and $142,500 respectively. So again, $188,200 versus $14,100. That gap is the decades-long result of ongoing discrimination and how it continues to perpetuate to this day. And Hispanic median and mean wealth is $36,100 compared to $165 respectively. Again, the Latino population has about twice the mean wealth, the median wealth, as African Americans in this country. So from 2007 to 2019, the median wealth for all racial groups in the US declined approximately 30%, because what happened? We had the Great Recession. For African Americans and Hispanic families, wealth declined an additional 20% from 2010 to 2013. Meanwhile, white families' wealth was essentially unchanged, and the wealth of all other races fell a more modest 10%. So even though the median wealth for all racial groups rose in 2013, the typical Black family has yet to recover their pre-2008 levels from the Great Recession. And now, on top of that, today we're facing what? Coronavirus, and the impact of that on Black wealth as well. So it is imperative, it is so important that we do everything we can to educate ourselves about credit, investments, retirement, estate planning, financial planning. Those 5 pillars, if you will provide a foundation upon which we can build and become better stewards of our finances and do our best individually to make changes so that we can begin to turn the corner on the wealth gap. Now, the racial wealth gap, as I stated, will be fixed through the enduring work of political advocacy. In 2018, the Samuel Dubois Cook Center on Social Equity published a study entitled "What We Get Wrong About Closing the Wealth Gap." And what they've stated here is that I'm going to quote this, "We challenge the conventional set of claims that are made about the racial wealth gap in the United States. We contend that the cause of the gap must be found in the structural characteristics of the American economy, heavily infused at every point with both an inheritance of racism and the ongoing authority of white supremacy. Blacks cannot close the racial wealth gap by changing their individual behavior, i.e., assuming more personal responsibility." And that's a term that we often hear thrown around in politics a lot. "Or acquiring the portfolio management insights associated with financial literacy. If the structural sources of racial inequality remain unchanged, so there are no actions that African Americans can take unilaterally, that will have much of an effect on reducing the racial wealth gap. This has to be a collective. It has to be policy that goes into the communities and literally infuses neighborhoods that has historically been discriminated and subjects of discrimination, and infuse wealth and policies and change for job creation, business development, and education achievement. So for the gap to be closed, America must undergo a vast social transformation produced by the adoption of bold national policies that will forge a way forward by addressing finally the longstanding consequences of slavery, the Jim Crow years that follow, and ongoing racism and discrimination that exists in our society today. So think about it this way. The challenges that we face today in our country, in our communities, is largely the result of bad policy. So logically, you would think that to rectify this issue, it would take good policy so that we can close the gap and lift everyone to a respectable level of equality in our nation. However, when you're talking about policy, and I'm using that word, what people hear is reparations. And that's a hot topic. It's a debatable topic. If there's any one topic that could potentially divide this country, unlike anything we've ever seen, it is the notion that folks are going to have to reach in their pockets, or the IRS is going to pull money out, the government, and give it to Black people. Okay. Now, let's be clear. Other races of people in our country have been paid reparations. In fact, under President Obama, Jewish Americans, survivors of the Holocaust, were paid reparations. So this isn't anything new. But if you think about it, the structural damage that was done, it continues to linger. It continues to haunt in an economic way, and to a large degree underdevelop communities of color, African-American communities in particular. So the answer has to be policies that will go into those neighborhoods and rebuild. I mean, think about it. If you look at a road or highway that cuts right through a Black community, and this is proven, a lot of that structural infrastructure was placed there to divide people by race. Well, some would argue we are in a post-racial society. Well, guess what? That highway's still there. There are structures that are still physically there that are like monuments to white supremacy, that are still having an ongoing, lingering effect in a negative way on those communities. So I really believe that you have to have a discussion that leads to restorative policies in our country so that you can begin to restore wealth and strengthen the community. Let's think about the impact of that now. A study underwritten by McKinsey in 2019 revealed that closing the wealth gap results in 1.5 trillion in incremental GDP to the US economy, or 4 to 6% if closed by 2028. And another study stated that if the wealth gap had been closed 20 years ago, we would have an additional $16 trillion in GDP in this nation. So if we had addressed this problem 20 years ago, today our nation would have 16 trillion additional dollars. And there's a lot you can do with $16 trillion. So this isn't just a clarion call to close the gap to improve the economic well-being of African Americans. This rising tide will lift all boats. It will help strengthen the entire American economy. Whites, Blacks, Asians, Latinos, everyone will benefit if our nation takes this moral imperative seriously and does what it should do to undo the damage that was done for 90 years following 246 years of enslavement in this country. So on top of that foundation, if you will, now we've got to talk about education. Because again, think about it. You've heard the stories about people who win the lottery and they find themselves in debt and broke shortly thereafter. You have to understand how money works and how to make money work for you so that you can have a sustainable, longstanding wealth building apparatus, if you will, in your family that will look like stocks and bonds and exchange traded funds. It will look like the proper estate planning and insurances in place, and also real estate, both residential and commercial. And I must say, in this era of the pandemic, we have to be concerned with now income protection, because, and I'm talking specifically about disability insurance. Usually we think about disability for the self-employed, maybe the construction worker, but not the average person who works behind a desk. But what can COVID do? If you survive it, Lord willing, it could still render your quality of life severely diminished from a healthcare perspective. And so a person can find themselves surviving COVID-19, but unable to work or on dialysis or with heart problems or liver problems or kidney problems. And so effectively disabled, but living and young. And so one of the ways to destroy wealth is not having the proper insurance in place to protect your income source. And so in this environment of the pandemic, we have to start thinking about the additional expense as it is an investment to protect our income called disability insurance. Real quick, I'm just going to go through some of the differences between families' gross, what impacts wealth across races. And this is different for white and Black families, okay? So inheritance from other family members and support from friends. White families are considerably more likely to receive an inheritance or a gift, including large estates. So inheritance is what impacts wealth across races. Also, housing, key. Housing impacts it as well. 46% of white families own their homes compared to 17% of African-American families. So parental wealth may be an indicator of this difference, as Black families are less likely to receive a down payment assistance from their parents. Now, I'm blessed and grateful to say my oldest daughter just bought a house in Baltimore, and it was it's a blessing to be able to say, hey, here's some money for the down payment on your home to kick that off as a legacy thing in our family, and hopefully she'll do the same for her children. Now, I've got 7 children, 6 daughters and a son, so I'm sure I'll be making many down payment assistance to our kids going forward. Retirement accounts. You have to fully max out your 401k if you have one. If your job doesn't have one, advocate for one. And if they're not going to get one, then at the very least, set up, if you qualify, a Roth IRA or an IRA. 65% of white families have at least one retirement account compared to 44% of African-American families and 28% of Hispanic families. So impacting these statistics is access to additional funds to save for retirement. Now we're talking about income equality, because if you're not making enough money, then saving for retirement may feel like an additional burden. And this is where you have to upgrade your skills if necessary, consider either a second job or going back to school, but you have to fight for your own future retirement security, because no one else is going to fight for it unless you do. Emergency savings. Black families have $2,000 or less in savings compared to white families that typically have 4 times that amount. So again, emergency savings, I always say you should have about 6 months of your income or expenses in the bank that you don't touch, arm's length for emergency savings. And again, I mentioned COVID-19, so we have to talk about that because as of December 31st, the moratorium on foreclosures and, well, that foreclosure moratorium ends, I think, in February, but evictions, that ends December 31st. Right now, there are 2 million Americans who are 90 days late on rent. And then you're going to have the forbearance end with respect to people who were not able to pay their mortgage as a result of the pandemic. So emergency savings, unfortunately, you're going to see a lot of evictions, and you're probably going to see rental prices go up because of it. And housing, we're at a housing peak right now. Housing will probably fall. So there'll probably be more inventory of housing on the market, probably starting around June of next year, because it takes some time to go through that cycle. But there will be, if you think it's hard to find a place to rent now, imagine when all these people unfortunately find themselves without housing if they're not able to get employment. So emergency savings is crucial, is critical, and you got to start as soon as you can. So everyone, I'll wrap this up, everyone should share, all Americans should share the burden of advocating for closing the racial wealth gap because, again, according to the study by McKinsey and Company, it does impact the entire U.S. economy. So there is a moral imperative for closing the racial wealth gap. The insidious effects of racism and discrimination are that it will eventually catch up with either those who are sponsors of it or their progeny or their children and their children's children. So it will come back to hurt and haunt the same people who, were early sponsors of it. Financial literacy is one side of the coin. The importance of being educated about personal finances cannot be overstated. However, every coin has two sides. So restorative public policy must accompany adequate financial education in credit management, investments, debt management, estate planning, retirement planning, investment management. And that's pretty much everything that we teach here at my firm, Wealthcare Financial Group Incorporated. So that's going to wrap up sort of my introduction and the appeal I'm making for financial literacy and also public policy and how that will, I believe, improve our status in this country and close the racial wealth gap. If you have any questions, my contact information is in the notes. I've included a book reading list and my website, blog, email address, and phone number, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. This was something else. We still have a lot of work to do. I have a few questions in the chat. Someone asked, how much money does it take to invest?
It doesn't take a lot of money to invest. One of my early investments was literally just $1,000. I remember years ago, about 15 years ago, I put $500 in a preferred stock and in a common stock. Company was called Smurfit Stone. They make those corrugated boxes. Like you ever go into a grocery store, you see those displays, and it'll be that's what they were making. They were in bankruptcy, and I bought the stock because it was being battered. And about 3 weeks later, that $1,000 grew to $15,000. So I've had both experiences, though. I've made money and lost money, and the nature of investing is learning how not to lose money, and that is on the basis of doing good research. The more you learn, you're going to learn how not to lose money. That's what investing is all about. And if you just throw money out there, and a lot of people are getting these apps like Robinhood and so forth, they're investing, and a lot of folks jumped on the Apple stock bandwagon because Apple split, and they split so many times before. And I was telling some friends and even clients, look, let's just kind of wait. Let's wait. Now, some clients I bought Apple because they wanted it, but others I said, let's wait. Let it come down after the split. And what happened? Post-split, stock dropped from over $130 down to like $112, $114. So that just comes from years of experience and understanding the nature of stocks and how what we call in our industry the efficient market theory, which basically states that all the information out there to make a decision about the valuation of a company is available. The markets are efficient. And so in other words, the real value of a company is going to be revealed in the stock price. Even if it gets overinflated, it's still going to come back down to fair value at some point.
How does voting or not voting affect the situation? I mean, you talked a lot about public policy. I would think that that's crucial.
Yeah, voting voting is okay. Let's just talk about what's happened since 2013. Voting rights. Chief Justice Kennedy is not a fan or protector of voting rights, in particular for African Americans. The case was Shelby County v. Holder, and there was a pre-clearance requirement because, as you know, there are some states that historically have engaged in voter suppression, a lot of southern states from the Jim Crow era. And so the pre-clearance requirement was that for a state to change certain voting laws, they have to pre-clear it in Washington, D.C. on a federal level. Well, Justice Kennedy concluded that we had achieved a post-racial society, and you cannot no longer require these states to pre-clear if racism isn't impacting anyone anymore. Well, that's not true. And unfortunately, that one rung was taken out of voting rights, if you will. And what do we see immediately? Texas, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the Midwest and the South started requiring voter IDs, and you have situations like in Milwaukee where there's like there's five or less than five polling places, but in Madison, Wisconsin, there's like over 60. So you have voter suppression widespread, and the only way you're going to overcome that is by voting. Voting is what gave us Donald Trump. And I will say, unfortunately, the number of African Americans who were not registered to vote were greater by percentage than the number of people who voted for Trump in many states. So we can look at ourselves in the mirror and say, we have this president because of the number of African Americans who were not registered to vote. We could change that. We could have changed it. And as President Obama stated before he left office, he said voting rights is on the ballot. Healthcare is on the ballot. All these things are on the ballot. So if you do not vote, you also receive what's called proxies as investors. You get a chance to vote on corporate decisions that impacts the stocks that you may or may not, that you may own. So voting is essential. I want to know what's going on with these companies when I buy them. I want my voice heard. And when I'm thinking about how Amazon is managing the company and I'm a shareholder, so these are the types of things that are so critical, so crucial that a lot of us don't realize. Right. There's just no excuse for not voting. I'll say this: a year and a half ago, I went to the lynching museum, as it's called, in Montgomery, Alabama. And all it takes is to see those pillars that are about 5,000 roughly pillars with names from top to bottom representing every county almost throughout the South, and definitely almost every single state in this nation. Then there's little signs that tells you why people were lynched. Some signs say this person was lynched because he or she voted, or he or she registered to vote, or he or she registered other people to vote. So this is serious business. We can't not vote. People were terrorized for about almost 100 years because of our power to vote. So we have to get this right, and we have to vote.
What sources do you recommend for determining good investments?
A good source, are you referring to education?
Well, anything. I mean, like stocks, real estate. What's good to invest in now?
Oh, okay, good to invest in. So we call that in our industry asset classes. So for example, corporations or companies, they come in roughly three sizes: small, medium, and large. And the asset class, it could be a small company, medium company, large company. And another term we use is capitalization. So we'll say small cap, mid cap, large cap. Capitalization refers to the number of shares outstanding of a company's stock multiplied by the price per share. So that gives us the total valuation of a corporation. So if we say small cap is like 2 billion, mid cap 5 billion, large cap 10 billion. And then there's asset classes, real estate, bonds, international, investing in commodities. And so the economic cycle goes through this period of recession, trough, recovery, expansion, peak. Kind of goes like this. And depending on where we are in the cycle, either one of those asset classes may or may not be the best investment. So for example, if we're in a peak, what you normally find is that the stock market is climbing like it was prior to COVID, and inflation is moving higher. And so what happens? The Federal Reserve will raise interest rates to offset inflation. When interest rates get so high, that is a sign that we are definitely in an inflationary economy. It gets to the point where the market peaks out, and then you have this phenomenon called recession, because companies now have to go from mostly cash spending, capital spending, to credit. And when rates get so high and then a recession happens, you get mass layoffs. So the Federal Reserve would then reduce interest rates to incentivize companies to hire or to incentivize business growth again, and that heats up the economy. Well, in a recession, when rates are being reduced to incentivize job growth and so forth, what happens? Real estate prices move up because people are now refinancing their homes because rates are dropping. They're buying more homes. Right now it's a seller's market because rates are so low. So you got to look at the economic cycle, and that's one of the things we do here in Wealthcare Financial Group is really understand where we are economically, and then we build custom model portfolios and disproportionately weight each asset class so that we could optimize portfolio based on where the economy is today and where it's going in the future.
Okay, here's another question. With 401k and other investments, putting money into a variety of companies that may be harming the environment, example, fossil fuels, and causing other harm to communities globally. Is it possible to ethically invest? And how do you invest without causing further harm to our communities in the process?
Right, so there are what we call ESG or social responsible investing. And there are a number of options available. In fact, one of the things we do is we build model portfolios just for clients who want to invest in a social responsible way. They don't want to invest in private prisons. They don't want to buy sin stocks like tobacco and those sorts of things. They don't want to invest in companies that make weapons. So yeah, there are a number of options. But here's the thing you got to be concerned with as well is how far down that rabbit hole do you want to go? Because it's one thing to police your own dollars, to not invest in a company directly that engages in some practice you don't like. But then how do you know to what degree that company is investing their portfolio in social responsible things as well? So it gets layers deep. And at some level, unfortunately, you might find that at some level, at some point in time, a percentage of your portfolio may cross over into an investment that one person may feel is questionable. But yes, we can, for the most part, build a model portfolio that is intentionally socially responsible.
Okay, if you're starting from scratch and have a few assets and little time, where should you turn to get educated in managing your long-term finances without getting overwhelmed?
So what we offer at Wealthcare Financial Group is a complimentary written financial plan. We utilize a software called Money Guide Pro. If you go to moneyguidepro.com, that is a widely used financial planning software in our industry. Most firms will charge you a good $5,000 to $7,000 per year on a recurring basis to provide access to that tool. We offer it complimentary. We always have. I started out actually in this industry by educating families in Southeast and Northeast Washington, D.C. right after I finished Howard University about financial literacy and how to invest and so forth. So I've always done financial planning complimentary. I think it's important to offer something back to the community, and giving advice, I don't think it's something you should have to pay for, at least in this regard from us, because it's, you know, you can get on the internet, but I'm going to just tell you straightforward what I think is best suited for you. And so, yeah, contact me and we'll set you up with Money Guide Pro, walk you through it, and we'll help you get started on saving and advise you through the process of being prudent with your finances.
Okay, is one more question. Is there an ethic social investing list? Is there a list of somewhere that of companies that are socially and ethically minded?
Yeah, in fact, one company is in Bethesda called Calvert Funds. Calvert is one of the early pioneers of socially responsible investing on Wall Street, so to speak. They're right in Bethesda, Maryland. And but if you Google social responsible investments, social responsible exchange traded funds, or ESG funds, and the ESG is interesting because they don't just look at like environmental investing and that kind of thing. They also look at the structure and nature of corporate boards to see if they are diverse. So they look for like things like discrimination within corporate boards, not just, hey, are they buying tobacco? You know, I like that because we definitely need diversity in corporate boards. That's a huge, it's another, again, a throwback to this topic about the wealth gap and financial literacy. It's a big issue. So check out ESG investing. There's a lot of information out there that's been written about it. But in particular, Calvert Funds in Bethesda, Maryland is one of the leading pioneers of social responsible investing.
Thank you so much. Now, we're getting ready to close out. So what is the one action tip that you can advise everybody on this call? What do we need to do? I mean, there's a lot of barriers out there, but what do we need to do to get around this, if possible?
So what I did, I didn't study finance at Howard. I studied communications. So I wasn't born and bred sort of this finance guy. It's something I learned and developed a passion for by reading. The book list is a great place to start. Just get one of those books. If you have to get Audible, look, I listen to more books on my phone than I have time to read. Okay, I have an extensive library. I'll play books on my on Audible on my phone because I can get through it a lot faster. Get Audible and just buy some of those books on the list and just start listening to it, because you have to start to train yourself to understand the language of finance. And then you'll start to gravitate into the areas that I think are going to be more reflective of your personality and things that you want to invest in. And of course, you can always call me if you have any questions. My number, email address is on the site there in the chat section. So feel free to give me a shout. I'm happy to help.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mr. Smith. We really appreciate these invaluable insights. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for another Inspiration Action. You have a great day, and let's all get out there to vote. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Smith. We will definitely take your advice and look into your information. Thank you for joining us. I'm gonna answer everyone's questions in the chat section. So if you post a question, I'll stay on. I won't be on video, but I'll answer your questions directly in the chat section. Okay. Okay then. Okay, so everyone, whoever wants to stay on this call, Mr. Smith will be on it also to answer questions. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm gone for the day. Okay. Bye. Bye-bye.